Welcome to this morning's Licensing and Regulatory Committee. First item is the minutes of the meeting held on the 11th of November that have been laid on the table. May I sign those as a true record? Thank you. Any apologies for absence or substitutions?
Thank you, Chairman. We've had apologies from Councillors Jackie Keane and Michaela Martin, and there are no substitutions.
Thank you very much. Any declarations of interest, please?
None received prior to the meeting.
Colleagues, anyone have any to make? No, good, excellent, thank you. Are there any questions from members of the public?
No questions, Chairman.
And any questions from members?
No questions.
Thank you. Now, item 6 is the nomination of a replacement representative on the Licensing General Purpose Subcommittee. Do we want to go ahead with that, or do we want to await the election?
The by-election is on the 13th of February. There will be, depending on the outcome of that, there'll be a recalculation of the committee numbers. So it doesn't necessarily follow that the member who comes on for Milford will be on this committee, because that will depend on the outcome. So given that it's just another month, you can hold it over.
I think that would be sensible, and we can fill in should there be from one of the substitutes.
Yes, that'd be fine.
Okay, are we agreed with that? Thank you very much. Any action been authorised by the Executive Director? I hope not, because I don't know about it.
No, nothing, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Good. So, next item on the agenda is number 8, the minutes of the Licensing General Purposes Subcommittee that was held on the 14th of October. I think they've already been to Council and been approved, but nevertheless we're asked for them to be approved. Is that agreed? Thank you. 9 is the joint warranting 2020, and I'll ask Mr. Hughes to introduce this item and then ask members for comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The joint warranting project is basically to delegate Surrey Council's enforcement functions, as in Appendix A on page 17 of the report, with regards to the hackneying private hire trade. Generally, in the last couple of years, the law changed, and we have what we call private hire operators, and they designate drivers, give them jobs, and they put them out to private hire drivers. And a hackney carriage can work as a private hire operator in another area. Previously, an operator in a Waverley area, for instance, could only give it to another operator if he couldn't cover the job in the same borough that he was licensed in. So a Waverley operator to another Waverley operator. But the law changed, and it now allows for a Waverley operator to give the job to a Guildford operator or a Staines operator. And what it's caused is a lot of issues with drivers operating as hackney carriage drivers, operating as private hire operators in different boroughs. So, for instance, at the moment, we have a lot of Epsom and Red Hill vehicles in our areas doing jobs as private hire for our operators, because there's a particular operator in our area, for instance, that has an office in Epsom and Ewell, Red Hill and here. So you've got a trinity of licences. So an operator has to give it to his the same driver and vehicle that he's licensed with. That's the trinity. But if I have an operator's licence in Epsom, I have to give it, if I get the job, I have to give it to an Epsom driver in an Epsom vehicle. But now I can, because I've got an operator in Waverley, I will give the job to the Waverley operator and he can give it to a Waverley driver. And it's all done in the cloud a lot of the time now, not physically. It's all on electronic systems. So that's the issue we've got. And enforcement officers don't have that power to look at vehicles from other areas and drivers from other areas. We only have the power in our own area to look at our own vehicles. So the whole point of this joint warranting is to give other Surrey authorities powers to look at our vehicles and them to give us powers to look at their vehicles. Does that make sense?
Thank you very much. Councillor Ellis first.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm all in favour of this, but forgive me if I'm misunderstanding, but if you go to page 39, recommendation 11, does that impact?
That's wrong.
Sorry. Yes, but the recommendation is there. Government should legislate that all taxi and PHV journeys should start and or end within the area for which the driver, vehicle and operator are licensed. So as I say, forgive me if I misunderstand, but are those incompatible with each other?
That is a recommendation that the Task and Finish Group, the government asked the Task and Finish Group to have a look at different bits and pieces, and that's one of the recommendations they came up with. But the government haven't put these recommendations in place, so they were only recommendations, so that there's no legislation there at present. That's hence why we want the joint warranting, so we can do something about it at the moment.
Thank you, Chairman. I do totally support this.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, but I think you've made a very good point, this being in the papers. If this comes in, then it would put a stop to what we're currently discussing. That wouldn't be permissible anymore.
Yeah, if it was put in, it wouldn't necessarily, but you would still get vehicles coming into our areas. It's only start and finish, so they could finish in this area. And again, depending how the legislation's made out, but if we did give those powers, then we could, I suppose, we could rescind it in the same way.
Thank you, Councillor Davidson.
Now that I'm fully identified, apologies for not doing so earlier. The question I've got is, I fully support the idea about Surrey-wide openness in terms of regulatory control or enforcement control. A lot of our drivers that I've experienced come from outside Surrey, particularly Liphook, where there's quite a pool of private hire vehicles. Now, what is the plans, or is there a plan to extend this use of enforcement across county borders?
Yes, before this meeting, the joint warranting project was put via the management board first, and that was one of the recommendations from the management board was once we've got this in place is, and I believe Richard's going to draft a letter, is to approach the other councils that we border, because we're on the edge, we border in other councils, to ask them to do the same thing with us.
If I can continue, that seems to me that we're moving more and more to a national-wide enforcement regime, which would seem to me to be very sensible.
Thank you. Yes, in fact, that was a point I was going to make, because the Vice Chairman and I had a meeting with officers before Christmas, and we did suggest that, like Rushmore, East Hampshire, Chichester should be approached. So once we've done that, we will be writing to those authorities, will we? Do we need to make that a recommendation, or can we just say that's what we want to do? Because would it have more force if it has kind of a recommendation from the committee that we do that? But I'll be guided. I'll be guided by officers, but I think we could just put in can you think of a recommendation just to include everybody that borders us, that we approach us, and everybody will probably agree. Okay. Any other speakers on this? Okay. Well, we are asked to recommend to council, so it's got to go to council to do this. as is set out in the agenda A and B. We need a C to ask officers to
recommend that the head of service writes to other local authorities bordering Waverley within Hampshire and West Sussex to consider similar reciprocal arrangements.
Okay, members, then with that addition, is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you very much. Number 10 is the taxi policy covering report and the proposed changes for consultation in this year. Mr. Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, this is a review of our taxi policy, which we do on a regular basis regarding changes in the law, etc., and things that come about. The main changes that we have put forward is for a new privacy notice. This is to have one in the policy following the GDPR regulations. We've also requested for private hire operators to have basic DBS criminal record checks for employees and have a policy regarding that. One of the other main ones to do with private hire operators is to prohibit PCV vehicles being licensed for their drivers. We've also looked at the vehicle age policy, vehicle write-offs using vehicles that have been written off by insurance companies. We'd like you to review the tar age, have that added to the policy, and to consider our current policy regarding window tinting. They were the main ones, main changes.
Thank you very much, colleagues. So there are some recommendations here. We did with the first block, which considers the draft Hackney carriage and private licensing policy at Annex 1. And the recommendations there on that first. Councillor Goodridge.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The report was fine. I found quite a lot of spelling and grammatical errors, which I don't need to bother with, save when they're in the policy, because there were spelling and errors there too. Page 52, wheelchair accessible training. It's got odd designated wheelchair vehicles instead of. On page 11, I can't actually understand part of it. On the thick print, I think it should be a full stop after boundaries on the first line. The previous should be previously. And boundary needs to be spelt right. And grandfather, I don't understand. So I was going to ask the question, what are grandfather rights? I haven't come across it before, but then that's my ignorance probably rather than anybody else's. But well, I mean, in principle, the things that have been added I'm happy with, but as long as it can read correctly, because we're going out to consultation, and it doesn't look good if we send a document out that doesn't make sense.
Thank you very much. I think grandfather rights are ones that are long-standing, but Mr. Hughes will confirm for us, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, we've had grandfather rights before, is where, for instance, we have a vehicle and we change the age policy. So we might say the current ones that are licensed will be given grandfather rights, and any new vehicle will have to follow the new regulations. Like, for instance, we had it with window tinting. So when people that already had a vehicle with tinting, when it was introduced, then they were allowed to continue to license that vehicle, even though it didn't meet the current new standards, but any new vehicle would have to meet the current standards.
Mr. Chairman, can I just check that that's well-known phrase in the trade? Is it everyone knows what grandfather rights are?
I've never had an issue with it before.
Okay, fine.
Councillor Reid.
I just wanted to ask the Officer Hughes, whether what he's just said explains window tinting. As a new councillor, what are exemptions, please?
What are the exemptions for window tinting? At the moment, our current vehicles, like the law states that all vehicles have to have 75% light transmission through the front window, and the driver and front passenger must have 70%. They don't have any legislation regarding the rear windows. We require our vehicles, the rear windows, to be in line with the front door windows and also be 70% light transmission. We have given exemption, like we do with plate exemption, for certain vehicles, like chauffeur. We won't give it to Hackney, it's with private hire vehicles. And if they can have like a chauffeur type business where they've got clients, we gave one to somebody with clients for soldiers. They had a contract picking up American soldiers from Farnborough Airport, and they were in uniform, so they didn't want people to be able to see them in uniform. So if they give a specific reason for exemption, and it's a private hire vehicle, it can be considered in line with like plate exemption.
Couple of questions, and well, one question and a concern. On the recommendation for CCTV, I can understand why that's there, but my concern is the possible use of that for blackmail by the driver who's screening what's going on behind. What kind of controls are you looking to put into place there?
Well, currently we're not looking at adding it, we're just making you aware of it. It was one of the recommendations by the government, but what we've seen so far is that it's a can of worms. There's good parts to it and there's bad parts, and some councils have done it, and then because you've got sound recording as well, which there's all sorts of regulations. So at the moment, our policy, we don't have one of it, on it, and if people inquire and want to put it on, we don't stop them, but we tell them they must comply with the government ICO regulations and they must follow those. So unless the government sets it out at the moment, we're waiting and going to follow their lead at the moment.
And the question I've got is, are we doing anything about introducing or making regulatory control over emissions from our private hire vehicles or Hackney cabs? You know, my own sense is that what we should be doing is following the kind of routes which I think Transport for London are doing, and insisting that any new registered vehicles are ULEV compliant. And if that's not the case right now, because there needs to be a lead time, I would ask that that be put in place as soon as is possible.
Currently, obviously, when vehicles get tested, there's the emissions check there, which the MOT emissions checks. We're looking at introducing where we've mentioned the age policy, which will help. Some councils have looked at doing Euro 5, Euro 6. Problem with those is they change all the time and are constantly changing, where an age policy, if it's 2-3 years old, they will be compliant with the Euro specific. So it will be up if we if we reintroduce the age policy and bring it to 2 or 3 years, then the vehicles will be compliant with the emissions. We've also mentioned in here about encouraging electric vehicles and giving them a reduction in the fee, a 50% reduction in the fee to help encourage drivers. We have a lady within the council that deals with the emergency climate change, and we're suggesting ideas with her about, they're working Surrey-wide and nationally about introducing taxi ranks for electric vehicles only, for instance, to try and encourage them. And because Surrey are involved, where we want to have a taxi rank, we have to get Surrey's permission and the police permission, and we've had difficulty in areas where taxi drivers would like taxi ranks, say like the High Street outside Wetherspoons, they would love one there. Because of the climate emergency, what we're hoping is that Surrey might get on board with us and make somewhere like that that's for electric taxis only. If we can get that on board, and that will help encourage taxi drivers, because they want a rank there to maybe get an electric vehicle and then they could sit out there. So there are a number of things that the council are looking at, and Richard might be able to explain a bit more.
If I can, Chair, I'd draw your attention to paragraph 363 in the report, which suggests that members may wish to consider setting a date before 2040. That's when all vehicles there'll be no more fossil fuel vehicles produced. You may want to consider a date before 2040 when you want all Hackney carriage vehicles to be ultra-low emission vehicles. So that is part of your age policy, could be saying that from a certain date, all new vehicles have to be ultra-low emission.
I would like to see that myself and would recommend that as well before 2030.
That's the date that's suggested.
Well, I said well before 2030.
Well before.
And I would think 2025 should be able to give sufficient warning to the operators that they need to think about their replacement vehicles being completely electric.
If that's a recommendation, Chair, it can be amended in the...
We would need that put formally. In the papers already, there is a recommendation for the introduction of reduced vehicle licence rate for ultra-low emission vehicles. We could make an amendment, but it would have to be a specific date. We can't say well before, or we would need to put a date in. And of course, this has to go out to consultation. And I suspect if we go too soon, because only 5 years people might just have bought their new taxi, you will get a lot of resistance from the taxi drivers, so we have to be reasonable.
Well, I sense that 2025 should be sufficient for new vehicles to always be completely electric, for new vehicles, not renewables.
Can I go on? You can only have one if it's available at the time and stuff, and then we're going to have lots of grandfathers because everything will be pre-electric. You know, if it's not available, you can't have it, you know, for a specific taxi or whatever. If somebody wants a taxi that is like a taxi and not a private hire car and stuff, and there are some, if it's not available to purchase, you can't have it.
Yes. I mean, that's great. Richard, yes.
Chair, if I can try to help. We're talking about an age policy here, which says, I think it's 7 years, isn't it, for the age of a vehicle. So no vehicle will be over 7 years old. If we then say that as of 2025, all new vehicles have to be ultra-low emission, we need to be clear that that doesn't mean all electric. It can be a hybrid vehicle. They're classed as ultra-low emission as well. So there are plenty of vehicles of that nature available. In the authority I used to work for, a significant proportion of the vehicles are now hybrid vehicles, and they're vehicles that are suitable for use as private hire vehicles and taxis, so there is no problem in sourcing a suitable ultra-low emission vehicle for use as a private hire vehicle or a taxi. If you wanted to introduce 2025, we're now in 2020, so people have 5 years before they have to comply with this. So any of them that have got vehicles now can carry on using them until 2025, until their age limit is reached. So I think we need to be clear that ultra-low emission doesn't just mean all electric, it means hybrid vehicles as well. That's the government definition. And secondly, that the combination of our age limit policy and the introduction of a deadline of 2025 for all vehicles to be ultra-low emission is perfectly achievable, I think, by the trade.
It would be all new vehicles from 2025?
Yes.
Yes, so somebody got one in 2024, that could continue until 2031?
Yes.
Okay. That doesn't seem unreasonable then, does it? It seems gives them time to think about what they're going to do. but as I say, would have to go out to a consultation. Vice Chairman, you go, and then Mrs. Ellis.
Yeah, just a question for Paul, if I may. In some cities in the continent, where they have hybrid vehicles, when they enter a town or a city centre, they are regulated in such that they have to use the battery in the town centre. Is that something that might come to Waverley in the future?
If I'm honest, that's the first I've heard of that, and I wouldn't know how they, I don't know if Richard's aware of that, maybe have a bit more knowledge, but yeah, I don't know how they would regulate or whether it's just on their own, yeah, if they're caught not using their battery.
Councillor Ellis, next.
Thank you, Chairman. Getting back slightly to the previous issue with ultra-low emission vehicles, we're suggesting a 50% discount in view of the fact that we can actually only recover the costs of implementing our policies. Is a 50% discount generous, overly generous, or reasonable? Thank you.
Yeah, well, we want to encourage low emission vehicles, and again, we have to recover the costs. So we look at our costs each year, and again, they're normally all on a 3-year period. So if we've lost money this year, then we have to recoup it the following years, or if we make a profit, then we reduce the fees. And again, it will be spread out between all licensees, so the ones that that don't have low emission vehicles may find that their fees go up slightly to cover the vehicles that do have low emissions.
So all in all, it would go up to cover the reduction. Councillor Ellis, you're next. Sorry, Councillor Reid, Mrs. Reid, you're next. I'm going back up my list. Sorry, Councillor Mrs. Reid.
Well, following up on
Oh, excuse me, Mrs. Reid, next.
All right. It's very important with our climate change emergency that we do give this greater thought, and because the majority of taxis, I believe, are diesel, and that is very highly polluting in the atmosphere. And the other issue is the vehicles idling when they're waiting either for a fare as outside a property or idling in general, basically. That's a very polluting thing. So I think we do need to give this a great deal of thought. And as for the Continental, I've been driving for many years in Europe, and yes, there is a policy of reducing or turning to battery-operated vehicles, and I think it's when they enter the restriction zone. So that's something that would maybe come in this country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you're next. If I'm missing anybody, excuse me. Yeah, please go.
Yeah, I was going to ask about, sorry, to get back to the age thing, because it occurred to me that if we've got a 7-year age and our target's 2030, then 2023 would be the correct date to introduce ultra-low emission vehicles. Because then in 7 years' time, it's 2030, isn't it? It would be a bit embarrassing to have diesels still going around after 2030.
Well, thank you. Officers, the practicalities of that, is that feasible, or are we going to get howls of horror from the taxi drivers?
Thank you, Chair. I think whatever you do with the licence, the taxi and private hire trade, there will be howls of objection. It's a tradition of the trade, if you like, that they object to almost everything. But they do have to be regulated. I think it would be perfect if you wanted to say 2023, that would be perfectly feasible, and introduce an age limit of 7 years. I don't see any problem with that. It will be out to consultation, so they'll have an opportunity to have their say. As I say, elsewhere there is a tendency for people to, operators to move towards hybrid vehicles and electric vehicles generally, and I think you would expect the trade in Waverley to follow suit. Because there are savings and benefits from them using these vehicles for them as well in the long run. And electric vehicles and ultra-low emission vehicles are becoming more affordable now as well. And the range of them is increasing significantly. So the issues of topping up the charge and that aren't there anymore with a lot of the newer vehicles. So I think if you wanted to introduce an age limit of 7 years and put 2023 as a deadline for when all new vehicles from 2023 had to be ultra low emission, that would be perfectly feasible.
Thank you. Councillor Davidson.
Sorry, following up on Councillor Ellis's points, Mr. Chairman, one of the concerns which I also had was the revenue which we would need to maintain, having done the reduction on ULEV vehicles. May I suggest that we consider, or the officers consider, raising the fee, the annual renewal fee for non-ULEV vehicles substantially year on year, and the 50% discount therefore will start to even itself out over the period. That will maintain a reasonable revenue income to be able to cover the costs of our licensing operations.
Thank you. Councillor Mrs. Reid.
Excuse me. My next note here is about the fact that certain boroughs, particularly Guildford, increase their taxi fares every year on an annual basis. Is it right to say that ours is every 5 years?
We don't have a set period at present. Guildford have gone on to the new methodology, and now they've got that in place. They're able to do it each year, whereas we do it when people request it. The taxi drivers normally request we want a fare, and they start writing in, and then we have a committee and we consider it. So we haven't got a set period at the moment, but if we did follow through with the Guildford methodology, then that is the proposal would be that we would do exactly the same, as just have a look at it each year and do an uplift on inflation.
And we will come to that under item 11 if we, and we'll get a fuller update then if we may. Councillor Goodridge.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back to the thorny problem of tinted windows, which this council has discussed ad nauseam in the past. I mean, looking at the schedule of what the neighbouring authorities seem to do, Guildford seem to accept manufacturers' originally fitted windows. Woking don't seem to have a policy at all, so presumably they allow whatever tinted people want to put in or have manufactured. I have to say that it's weighing up the safety of the passengers in the back of the car so that they can be seen against the cost of sort of £1,000 or something of changing all your windows. If you buy a new vehicle and then have to immediately whip out all the rear windows and put in new windows, and whether they are even available. And I just wonder whether it is worth easing it slightly. I don't know. But if you know, I read all the letters from the taxi operatives, and you know, they have a standard letter which they seem to be using now, and everybody writes in. And I'm not one to sort of succumb to mass hysteria or you know, the person that can write the greatest number of letters. But I was slightly uncomfortable last time when we discussed it, and I just would like to know really how much safer is it to have you know, manufacturers compared to what we are now saying it should be in our policy? Is there a greater danger if we've got CCTV and everything else in there? I just feel we ought to discuss it, because I'm not totally convinced our policy is necessarily right. And I think it's being hinted in the report that we might wish to consider easing it a bit.
Thank you. Richard wanted to speak, and I'll come.
Thank you, Chair. If I can perhaps comment first on the issue of tinting. It is a delicate balance. It's a delicate balance between our responsibilities in terms of safeguarding, in terms of passengers in the vehicle, and balancing that against the rights and desire for privacy of other people when they're travelling in a vehicle. And you heard Paul say about soldiers in uniform not wanting to be seen in the vehicle. I've seen a number of these letters that are coming in, and letters written by customers of some of the businesses in the area where they are quite clear that because of the nature of their business, or because of they're wearing a uniform or something or other, they would not want to travel in a vehicle without tinted windows. And it's that delicate balancing act, be saying if a car's picking up people off the street like a Hackney carriage, where anybody could get in that vehicle, and it could be young children, it could be elderly, vulnerable people, then we want to give them some comfort in the fact that they'll be seen in the vehicle, and they can't, you know. Whereas other people want privacy. And it's for us in the middle to make that judgment about what's right and what's wrong is extremely difficult. We don't want to be seen to disrespect people's privacy, but on the other hand, we don't want to be seen to not undertaking our responsibilities in terms of safeguarding. So there has to be some judgment call there. If a business tells us that all of its business is connected with the military or connected with certain businesses that want privacy, it's people like people from the television and the media who want to have a bit of privacy as well. So there's lots of people that want privacy. There's other people that we are concerned about their safety and their safeguarding. And where do we draw that line? And who's to make a judgment whether it's right or wrong? And I do sympathise with you as members for having to make that decision about where the borderline is. But certainly to have an absolute that no vehicle can have tinted windows isn't going to satisfy a significant proportion of the customers of the trade. And I think there is scope for a bit of relaxation. It's becoming increasingly difficult to get new vehicles without tinted windows. If you go back a few years, tinted windows were an added extra. Now it seems that they're the standard because they're increasingly popular for private use. And that not having them is an option sometimes, although we're hearing more and more it's not even an option. And the vehicles come with tinted windows full stop. So I haven't got the answer, but it is a very delicate balancing act. But I do think there is some scope for some flexibility in it. The other point I was going to make, sorry, just quickly, was if we offer a discount on licence fees for ultra-low emission vehicles, it would be time limited. It would only be up to the point where our conditions say all new vehicles have to be ultra-low emission, because at that point there is no need to give a discount for incentive. So it would only be from now till 2023 if that's the date you agree on.
Yes, thank you. Paul.
Yeah, it's also just to mention regarding the tinting, where you said about new vehicles and getting a new vehicle and you having to suddenly pay the cost of replacing all the windows. It's just to mention that there are other conditions, like Guildford insist their taxis are wrapped and they have to pay, whether you buy a brand new vehicle, they have to pay $1,250 at the current price to have their vehicles wrapped, whether it's a new vehicle, old vehicle, to get licensed as a taxi.
Can you tell people what wrapped? Because I can hear them all. Thank you, Martin.
I was just going. I want to agree. I felt the same as Councillor Goodridge, that it's really the practicality aspect that got to me. Is it, if it's true that more and more manufacturers aren't allowing you to put in non-tinted windows, is it really fair, or is it even possible to carry on with that policy?
Yeah, I mean, one compromise seems to me that if a manufacturer can give you the option of having a car when you buy new, having tinted or not non-tinted, then they should choose the one that's non-tinted. But if the manufacturer can only sell you a car which has tinted, then really I think, you know, you should be allowed to leave it tinted and not have to do great things to try and find someone to replace all the windows. I mean, certainly for new vehicles, because I think we're probably looking more at new vehicles. I mean, the people who've already running things have already made the sacrifice, or they've used grandfather principles, or they've done something or other to get around it. But for new vehicles, it seems to me if the manufacturer does not offer tinted, then we should not insist upon it, is my thoughts.
Thank you. Paul.
Yeah, I understand your point, but the issue we got is it would be managing that, because you get the same vehicle with a number of different models, and there's some have lesser tinting, and some, like all the luxury vehicles, they tend to have the what they call the blackout tinting, which is you can't see anything in them. So it depends which model, which type, and stuff like that. And we would have to have different lists and trying to keep lists up to date, what car, and it would be hard to manage it that way rather than have a specific, whether it's Hackney's only require it and private hires can have what they want, whether it's a lesser percentage, 50% light transmission or 30%, it's easier because it's a measurement and it can be done, but it would stop the real dark, the blackout.
Yes, I mean, my feeling is that we wouldn't want to be blacked out altogether. I think that would be totally wrong. But, Councillor Davidson.
Just following up on, again, the tinted window issue. What increase has working experience as a result of its policy?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
Councillor Etheridge had pointed out that working didn't have a control on tinted windows. Have they experienced an increase in security issues or, security issues associated with their policy?
Again, not that I'm aware of, nothing's been said or not, but then they have used this argument before where we looked at the tinted originally when we last reviewed it, and how many times police have had it reported, but it isn't a question when somebody's been attacked or assaulted in a car, when the policeman turns up and says, did the taxi have tinting, and records it, the taxi had tint, there's no record kept of whether there's checked, so it's hard to tell whether it makes a difference or not.
If it's this, I understand, as Paul's mentioned, that the police don't record crimes in that way. It could be an incident happens in a taxi when it's used not as a taxi, if you like, as a family vehicle, and the police simply don't have that stats to give to us. I understand that requests have been made in the past, and I think you're right, just by way of additional clarification, there is a clear distinction between what may be manufacturer specification glass, which is compliant with the legislation, and the films or the privacy glass, which is a blackout effectively. And the question for you as members to consider is not only the cost element to drivers, but also the safety of the travelling public. That may involve vulnerable individuals, whether through alcohol or age, etc. But I know that other councils have looked at making exemptions where there's good reason, for example, medical reasons, light sensitivities for various conditions, for example, or as you've heard, in the more fleet pre-booked arrangements, which are for private hire vehicles rather than those that are sitting on the rank. And if I can just draw to your attention, it's going back to 2010, I'm afraid, but it's the guidance from the Department for Transport. But that confirms the light transmission details, and that authorities should be mindful of that, as well as the costs and inconvenience associated with changing glass that conforms to both construction use regulations, which is the legislation in place. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I don't know, does that guidance any further on what the construction use regulations are? I mean, is that a certain percentage?
That is the legal definition that was given to you by Mr. Hughes.
Yes.
Regarding the minimum requirements for windscreens in the front, driver windows, if you like. But as you've heard, manufacturer specification does allow the light tinting, if I can call it that, to the rear windows for comfort and safety. But no legislation covers the rear window.
Thank you, that's useful. Because we're going from item to item, I think perhaps we need to deal with the tinting, because the proposed allows exemptions to the window tinting policy subject to consultation with the chair of the licensing committee, but we also need to decide whether we're going to relax the current, but I think it's fairly clear we don't want to accept blackout. But what are our options, Paul? If we don't accept blackout, where can we go?
If you don't want blackout, so again, there would have to be some light transmission put in there. So at the moment ours is 70%, all right, that's the same as your driver's door currently at the moment. Whether you went to a lower percentage of light transmission, 50%, 40%, I don't know. Guildford use a 10 metre, which if you can see in the rear of the vehicle from 10 metres, I believe, then that's acceptable. But then it depends. For me, it depends whether it's at night or daytime, because I might be able to see it in daytime, but I might not be able to at night. So I do think we need some sort of percentage, and whether it's for taxis and for private hires, whether there's a difference there, because obviously private hires are pre-booked, so the majority you may well know your driver, your client that you're calling on, whereas a taxi you can just be hailed or sat at a station.
Okay. Councillor Mrs. Reid.
Please call me Councillor Reid. Basically, our job is to ensure the safety of our passengers who hire taxis. So I think that needs to be paramount. And I did hear and read about the Rochdale abuse, and we want to protect every member, male or female, of our community. So I think looking at, the minimum we can request is the paramount thing if people want the tinted windows, because I would feel much more safe in a vehicle, personally, if there was no tinting at all.
Are you minded to a percentage, or because we need to come up with something, so I look to members to what your feelings are. Councillor Goodridge.
I think, sort of reading what other councils are doing, the construction and use regulations seems to be saying, if I've got it right, that front windscreen 75, front side windows 70, and 22% seems to be the figure that's in the regulations for which I think I'm looking at Spelthorne. It says all vehicles must comply with the road vehicles construction and use regulations, and in particular requirements which state that as a minimum, and then it says new licensed vehicles will only be considered suitable where all rear side windows allow at least 22% of light to be transmitted through them. There is no minimum transmission requirement for the rear windscreen. So it seems to me that the regulations say, government regulations, that the side windows should have at least 22% of light, which I presume is not a total blackout, because that would be 0%. Now, I may have got that wrong, but that's what Spelthorne are doing, for example, 22%. Reigate and Banstead say factory-fitted tinted windows only. So, you know, it seems the majority of councils in Surrey are saying they must comply with the minimum requirements under the construction, road vehicles construction and use regulations of 1986, which would be 22%.
Yeah, unless there's been a recent change in the law, the requirements by the government only refer to the front and the front windscreen and the drivers and passengers' front doors. There's no regulation for the rear windows at all. So you can, on your personal cars, you can have blacked out windows if you want, apart from the front and the front windscreen.
If it assists, the regulations relate only to, as you've heard, all vehicles, and for safety and visibility of the driver purposes, it would seem as a matter of common sense, I think. But I think, as you point out, there is a distinction between manufacturer's specification and the blackout or privacy films or complete blackout, as you mentioned in some of the examples used by other councils in the neighbouring area.
It does seem to be, 22% seems to be a magical figure, because not only does Spelthorne say 22%, but so does Mole Valley, talking about regulations. So I'm sure that our legal advisor is right, but two councils are saying 22% in accordance with the construction and use regulations. Yeah, just comment that, that's all.
Yes, thank you. That I doubt that has been pulled out of thin air. Probably at some point that has been there. Would we be...
refer to the rear windows.
Yeah.
Refer to the rear windows.
We're just looking at the... See if we can find anything. Would we be, whilst we're looking for that, would we be able to say, well, manufacturer's standard fitment, or however they want to call it, but not total blackout? Would we be able to do that?
Again, it would be coming to when they're tested or enforcement of them, what is total blackout, what is a percentage. What I might think is total blackout is different to somebody else, whether there's a technical term or a percentage of lighting.
Thank you for the time to consider that. I'm afraid it's rather buried towards the end of the legislation and the regulations, but there are distinct classes of vehicles according to those used first, which would be the date of registration before the 1st of April 1985, where the percentage is 70% for all windows, and also there's a British standard specification which applies. Second criteria is in relation to vehicles first used on or after the 1st of April 1985 and trailers, and that specifies windscreens only at 75% and all other windows 70%, if that assists. There are
so which is the most recent? I was just looking at the construction and use regulations trying to, but...
It depends on the date of the registration of vehicles. Hopefully our taxi fleet will be vehicles from 1985 onwards, and we do have, I think, a small number of vintage or limousine vehicles which could be licensed, but it would be 75% in terms of the windscreen, and other windows would be 70, so
is that
30.
all other windows?
Yes, so the concession is a number between the 30 and that's been selected,
Could you just read it out again so that we're clear? Thank you.
So it's Table 2, Regulation 3210, which refers to motor vehicles first used before, which would be, I think, the date of first registration. The percentage is 70% for windows. And in relation to vehicles after the 1st of April 1985, windscreens at 75% and all other windows at 70%.
Mr. Chairman, might I suggest the solution is factory-fitted windows only, but the rear windows to be a minimum of 22%.
Yes.
Which would mean the first presumption, it's got to be factory fitted, and if it is factory fitted, it's got to be must allow at least 22% of light to be transmitted. So if you do have a posh car which has more or less blackout, well, I'm afraid that doesn't count. It falls at the second hurdle. But if it's a manufactured windows and it's more than 22%, then it would be all right. I mean, you've got to have something specific.
That sounds quite sensible, apart from the regulation that the our legal advice has found says certainty.
There are some exemptions in relation to vehicles used for security purposes or for police purposes, which aren't subject to those requirements, but are in relation to safety glass and safety glazing is in terms of their legislation. But there is a definition of what windows are, and it talks of
The 1986 are the most recent regulations.
Yes, so it relates to windows, and there is the exemption in relation to the rear of the vehicle, and it talks about technical details such as the angle of the the rear screen in relation to the axis, which do not they're not captured. So the rear is not captured, as you've heard. So it is 75 and 70, and that's confirmed in the note that's been passed to me by my colleague, which I'm grateful for.
Okay, well, as councillor, I think we need to come to a decision on this, and Councillor Goodridge has suggested that our policy be factory fitted, but with a minimum 22% being allowed through, so that would stop any blackout.
Yeah, we can enforce that if it was a 22%, because obviously when vehicles get tested with a light transmission at the Guildford testing station.
Okay, so that is a proposal. I'll second that. Has anybody, Councillor Ellis?
Sorry, I anticipated a vote. I would support that. Thank you.
Yes, are we agreed on that item? So we're
just before you do agree, it could just differentiate between Hackney and private hire. Do you agree that for all vehicles, or just for private hire and a stronger one for Hackneys? I don't know.
I don't really have any idea what 22% means in terms of visibility.
Basically, light goes through a window, and at the moment, what goes in there, we expect 70% to come out there, because there's not much.
Sorry, I didn't mean that. I do understand that. What I meant was, what does it actually look like? Have you know, is anyone? What could you actually see through a window that was 22%? That's what I mean.
I wouldn't know. I just expect it's not as much.
Councillor Reid.
Could you sort of compare it, or could anyone compare it with, you know, the light coming through an ambulance window, because they have tinted windows, do they not? Are they?
So that they can do anything that they might need to do to somebody and you can't see in.
I'd like to come back, because if we're setting this a sort of standard, does it mean that it's acceptable, or is this still, you know, something that we would consider as acceptable, or is it going to be creating a precedent? Saying about the minimum.
At the moment, it goes out to consultation anyway, so people could say no, that's not right. Taxi drivers would probably say no, we don't want any restriction, and members of the public might say that's too much. So we're not tied to this. This is for consultation. Councillor Ellis.
Thank you, Chairman. I do know that this is an issue that has concerned and phased out taxi drivers for a very long time now. So I do think that it's incredibly important that we actually make a recommendation that's based on something that can be enforced. Thank you.
Just on the consultation, if I could, I know you mentioned the public there. It is heavily weighted in the taxi drivers' favour, because we send it to the taxi drivers, it's emailed to them. We do have it at our website, and we will have it, but it's not something that we tell everybody about in the general public. It's advertised on our website, but whether people go on there regularly to see what our taxi policy is. So yeah, it is weighted as far as we'll get most responses from taxi drivers.
Yes. Do we put notice in the paper? Is it required? I'm not sure.
No, we put notices up on our office downstairs. There'll be a notice on the notice board, one at the Farnham office. We generally put a notice by our taxi ranks, which are mainly at the train stations. We'll send it out to our drivers, we'll send it out to councillors and town councils. But yeah, it doesn't go in the paper.
Thank you.
In that case, Chairman, it should be sent to the newspapers, because after all, it's only members of the public that use a taxi. It's not the taxi that use the public, it's the public that are using the taxi. And they should, I mean, it'd be lovely if it's on the front page of the Herald saying, you know, do you wish to sit in the back of this car or this car? And then there is a public debate, and it's up to the taxi to then agree to what members of the public who are using the service should have. I mean, it's very simple to send the public consultation out to the Hazelmere Herald or whatever it is, and then it's up to them whether they stick it on the front page or not.
Yes, I meant a statutory notice that we do with certain things. There has to be a statutory notice, but I'm sure we would do a press release to the Herald and other newspapers saying that the consultation's open and telling them where it is, on the website.
We can speak to comms about doing that.
Okay, Martin.
I don't want to prolong it too much, but I just wondered if there was any research or evidence base for any of this, because from the beginning we've been told that it's a security issue, so therefore there must be some sort of evidence base for that. And if there is, then we should follow that. If there isn't, then kind of it's up for grabs.
I'm not aware of any studies or any evidence base. It's all been on different bits over the past. There's always been one while I've been here as Waverley, and that's what, coming up to 12 years now. We've always had the 70% light transmission. We did, when we did the last review, looked at Rotherham because they had a full overhaul following the issues there, and their whole department and their whole policies were reviewed and looked over, and and with a microscope. And our wording is the same as Rotherham's. We took it from Rotherham's for our 70%. So if that gives you any help at all.
Thank you. So we have the proposal that we go with factory standard fitted with a minimum of 22%, and that we go out to consultation on that. Does members any strong views, or are you happy to go with that? Have we agreed to do that? Okay, on that item, then we will take that as that item, that recommendation is being agreed. Another one which may be contentious that I would draw your attention to is the introduction of prohibiting the use of second-hand tyres and tyres that are 10 years or more old. Now, one of the reasons that officers are putting this in, if those members from certainly the Hindhead and Hazelmere area or long-standing members on the council remember the accident at the Hindhead Tunnel where the coach hit a tree, a fatal accident. The coach had a tyre that hadn't been used but was something like 15 or 20 years old that had been put on, and that failed. And this is a reason for making this recommendation, which seems to me to be very, very sensible. Is everybody happy with that recommendation? It seems an important safety matter. Mr. Hughes.
Sorry, Chairman, just to go back onto the tinting, could I just clarify that the tinting was for all vehicles, 22%, no differentiation? Thank you.
So we're happy with the tyres. Good, thank you. Members, have you any other items on the recommendations to raise, or are we happy with them? Councillor Ellis.
Thank you. Recommendation. I actually have to say, I went through the report thinking, great, that's marvellous, long overdue, but there are a couple of minor issues. Recommendation 28, which actually I think it's really important that all drivers should be able to communicate in English. From attending quite a number of hearings, we are actually required to provide interpreters, and I believe this is a great cost to Waverley, but I'm hoping that actually if we require all drivers to be able to communicate in English, that our need to provide interpreters for hearings will cease. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you've made a good point, but not only about the cost here or to at hearings that need to be able to understand and communicate as to where the person wishes to go, and if your English is either non-existent or very restricted, I can't see how you can possibly know where the passenger wishes to go, or perhaps stop on the way or whatever. So I think, yes, I think that's a very important thing to introduce. Have there any
Yes,
comment?
with the English language, we do all our meetings with them face-to-face generally in our knowledge test, and we do a test at the same time regarding the policy and requirements of the policy, and this is all done verbally, and we believe if they can get through that verbally, they're fine on their communication. If we don't feel that they're okay on their English, and we did bring one here that wasn't good with his English, and we did think it was good enough, but he had a qualification, a written qualification from the government that his English was. It was to the requirement of the London taxis. So I would think ours is probably a little bit higher because we keep that face-to-face meeting with them. We don't expect them to be able to write down, I know a few words in French, I wouldn't know how to spell them or write them, but I could communicate and ask someone the time perhaps. But yeah, so the written side we don't require them, but we do have an oral English test with them. And the reason for the interpreters, that was brought in by following legal and I think it was via court cases or whatever. There's one thing being able to communicate in the basic English, but when you come here and it's legal words and more complicated language, then that's why some of them have asked for an interpreter.
Chair, if I may add to that and the comments set out in the report, as you rightly point out, the key issues for drivers seem to be conversations with their passengers about destinations, passenger requests, dealing with those, being able to give change and receipts and providing excellent customer service, and dealing with emergency and challenging situations. So those are the matters that have been highlighted as key skills and areas. I think there has been in the past, for example, from Transport for London, a test which involved effectively what's been commonly referred to as an essay and a speaking test at some significant cost to their drivers, and that was at the cost of £180 and rolled out, but currently that has been suspended until September 20 for introduction of a national standard guidance, so that's very much been put on hold. And as you've heard, members, the licensing team do meet with prospective drivers and deal with various issues. It's a verbal test, as you've heard, and that's conducted at the present time, so if that additional information assists.
Thank you. We need to go back, I think, now to the dates of the introduction. Well, first, the introduction of a reduced vehicle licence rate for ultra-low emission vehicles, which we can deal with stand on its own. Are we happy to introduce a 50% reduction rate for those vehicles? And that would be immediately that when this all comes in, we would do that from that date. I understand that. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes, of course. Yes. So, are we happy with that reduction, Councillor Davidson?
I'm happy with that reduction, Chairman, but I would ask that, going back to the issue which Councillor Ellis raised earlier on the revenue income over the following years, that we may like to encourage ULEV vehicles more by raising the non-ULEV rate much higher than we currently would do, higher than RPI. And I would suggest something like we might want to consider a more complex set of rules for the non-ULEV as opposed to the ULEV vehicles. so that the non-ULEV could possibly increase 8% plus RPI per year, whereas the ULEV, 50% right now, rising by RPI plus 8% until 2025, and then they would just be straightforward RPI, or whatever it is we would normally use to increase the licensing fee. The aim of my suggestion is that we try and push non-ULEV vehicles off the road. So, you know, the non-ULEV would, RPI plus 8% would continue up to 2030. Yeah, so that would really try and encourage those vehicle owners to move off and find alternative, more convenient vehicles for matching the climate emergency targets.
Councillor Goodridge.
As I understand it, Chairman, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think the licensing operation here is on the basis of break-even. So if on the basis we're break-even, we're giving 50% and more people go on to low-emission vehicles, and therefore we're giving more and more 50%, it follows, as night follows day, that those that haven't got them will be going up and up and up. To set a percentage would be wrong, but it seems to me the policy of licensing breaking even should continue, and therefore the more, as I said, the more people we give 50% off, the more the others will have to pay to make the department break even.
It would happen automatically.
It would happen automatically.
We don't need to overcomplicate it, I think. Richard?
Yeah, I just want to be clear on that, if I can, Chair. It's national legislation that we can only recover our costs for the licensing service. So we couldn't say we'll put them up 10% plus inflation if that meant that we were going to start making a profit out of the licensing fees. So what we'd have to do some number crunching to work out and predict that if we had X number of ultra low emission vehicles licensed next year, that would be a drop of X amount. We would have to make that up by increasing the other fees. So we'd have to do the number crunching to balance the books, if you like, and increase other fees to make up the loss from discounting those.
Yes, of course, and they would rise as well because the 50% will be of the higher.
Yes.
And that of course, that's
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and following on from what Richard said, we do that every year anyway, because the accounts are looked at what our income and expenditure was. We generally get, I think it's about 94%, something like that, of our costs back, and they will then look at that setting for the next year to say, well, we need to recover more back or less back, etc., and it's done over a yearly period.
Thank you. So are we happy then with that recommendation that we introduce or reduced once this comes in after consultation? I mean, we're not making the decision today. This is all for consultation. Just to remind you that that's the case, but would we be happy with that recommendation, Vice Chairman?
Thank you. I understand the reluctance to put percentages in, and I would agree with that. However, if we just introduce some words somewhere that said the recovery of the 50% reduction will be from an increase, a future increase in the fee. So in other words, you're not putting a percentage in, but you're putting in a statement that says that's where that reduction is going to be covered from.
To put that in the policy itself, so the drivers and owners of the vehicles would understand. I personally don't have an issue, but I'd have to check the legal side that we could do that.
In terms of the resource and fee issues, that's covered by the Local Government Miscellaneous Provisions Act 1976, and as you've heard, as a legal basis that recovery of the cost of the administration of licensing that comes from that statute, so that comes directly from that law, and as you've heard, calculations would be done in due course. I don't see there being an issue with the narrative of that being put in amongst the consultation, and as you've heard, the recommendation, which you'll have seen at 2.7, suggests and recommends that we should level the playing field by mitigating additional costs by the trade with the wider social benefit, which I think you've highlighted being air quality, and the specific reference there to zero emission capable vehicles. Thank you.
So are we agreed that that is what we will do? Agreed, thank you. Other items that I think we do just need to make sure that you agreed. In the papers, there's the setting of a date for all vehicles to be electric. But I think we've moved to a position where we're saying all vehicles by 2030 will be ultra low emission vehicles. Otherwise, we could end up with vehicles not being available. So are we setting a date of 2030 for all vehicles to be ultra low emission? And then we'll move to electric when we're in a position to do so. Is that agreed? Thank you. And I'm sorry, yeah, I meant the run-out date with the 7 years. Yes, 2023 with a run-out date of 2030, yes. Yeah, yeah. And then the introduction of a refusal to licence written-off vehicles. I'll ask Mr. Hughes to explain further, but as it stands at the moment, I think you could have two halves put together, and they couldn't get through it. They can get through an MOT test and be licensed, and we're the position I think is that we don't want to do that.
Yeah, with regard to insurance write-off vehicles, there is legislation. There's the different categories, and they've recently changed. And there's certain ones that just cannot be put on the road. The government writes them off and they can't come on the road. There are others that the insurance companies write them off because it's more than half the value of the car to repair it, etc., etc. There's different things wrong. It is repairable, but having spoken to mechanics and people like that, they said with the modern cars, in the olden days, it was easier to spot the damage on the vehicles, but a lot of cars now have underbody casings, and it's hard to tell whether that was done correctly, that repair, or it was done by a garage around the corner or something, some mate that's just come out of school or something, welded it or something like that. So it is harder to check to see whether the vehicle is. So it's either to say that no vehicles at all, we won't accept write-offs, or there is they did mention that there's a special term, they can go and get their vehicle checked at this special place and get a special certificate to say what it is. But yeah, it was easier to say that, and the safer way was to say we wouldn't accept write-off vehicles.
That seems quite sensible to me. Members, are you happy that we don't accept write-offs? Agreed? Yeah, it's going to consultation. So that has covered, I think, the contentious points. Is anybody else on any recommendations not happy or want to raise any other issue? Martin?
I just wondered what, on page 25, there's mention of NR3 in relation to a national database, and I just wondered what that was.
Yeah, currently, and the government have looked at it in their recommendations. It's the National Register of Taxi Licence Revocations and Refusals. Basically, at the moment, there is no current national register that if we revoked a driver, he could then go to another council down the road and apply for them, and there's no register to say that he was refused. The only way we do is if we have any indication that they've been licensed in a different area, we will contact that council individually, but there's no national register. This is setting up a national register within what they call the NAFAN database. NAFAN already exists as a body. We have it for fraud departments, and it's all regulated, and we have to register with it. It's a policy, there's privacy policies for it, but basically we'd have to set it up, put ourselves on the system, and then every time we get a new driver, we can enter his name on the list, and it tells you whether that person with that date of birth there's an issue with him, and then it tells you the contact of the council to contact, and then you'd go to Birmingham Council and says, I've got so-and-so, they'd do the checks, and if it's the same person, they'd give us the information on why he was refused, revoked or whatever. We're looking at, again, with Surrey Wider doing it, we're looking at doing it, and we're hoping to get it in place by April this year.
So can we take the recommendations as we've made decisions on the certain ones, with those decisions included, agreed? Thank you. And thank you for your input, because it's quite important, and I realise it's quite difficult. Yes. Yes, well, we agreed with that the corrections for spelling, etc. Yeah, as agreed. And I think before the minutes are put anywhere, I think we need to see them, please.
And no introduction of new ones.
Thank you. Item 11 is the proposed fares and tariffs, and this is for an update from Mr. Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following the committee hearing on the 23rd of September, officers have worked on the figures for setting fares using the Guildford methodology as a template. A number of the figures relate to the 2014 AA cost survey, as this is the last one available. In line with Guildford, we have used those figures as the basis and given the relevant uplift according to the Office of National Statistics consumer price inflation. We've looked at that. We've also looked at, in July 2019, we carried an online survey out with licensed drivers, and we've used their comments to help complete the survey to take into account local variations. If you take away the pull-off fee, which is different to all the other mileage, the figure that we've come out is, at current, it would be £2.40 a mile. Our figures coming out at the moment is half of that, it's £1.20 a mile, so it's a 50% reduction. We need to look at it a bit further. We've asked Guildford to come over and go through it with us to see if everything's correct as far as our methodology has gone. Our figures are very similar to theirs. There's only a few differences. To do with the salaries. It's a few thousand difference between the salaries here and there, and the average mileage of a taxi, because we're a bigger borough. I think our average mileage was slightly higher, but yeah, ours comes out as quite a big difference to Guildford's, and a quite big reduction in the fares. So we're going to do some further work on it, and then we obviously put it past the number crunchers, because their maths are better than mine. Or should I say Jill's, because she's done most of the work, so thank you, Jill. But that's where we are at the moment. It surprised us with what it's come out with. It's quite a big reduction, but we're not 100% sure that it's coming out right.
Thank you. Members, have you any questions from what you've heard? Okay, well, we will expect to hear further in due course then.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. It's been brought to my attention there is one matter that wasn't a recommendation in the previous item, if we could just, and we were asked to consider the signage on, door signage on private hire vehicles, and I'm not quite sure really what that means. What door signage?
Currently, private hire vehicles can only be pre-booked, and they have to go through an operator and that, but they will sit around and wait. And a lot of other councils will have a sign on the driver's door and the passenger door, so this vehicle pre-booked only, or you must book this, to try and help differentiate when they're just sat outside the pub. Because you will get them trying to do that, sit outside the pub, they're quite obviously taxi, private hire, whatever vehicle, and someone will jump in and they'll take them off. It's trying to prevent that, to try and make everyone know this is a private hire vehicle and not a Hackney carriage vehicle.
There was no recommendation for us to do anything, just to consider. So would we like to add a recommendation there that we do require the signage then?
I would suggest we do, and then it goes to public consultation, but it seems eminent. It protects the Hackney hire people.
Yes, indeed it does. Yeah. So I'll second that we do that. Is that agreed? Can you add that as a recommendation, because there isn't one? So if we could just add that on the last item. Thank you very much for that. The forward programme, Mr. Hughes.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, you've caught me out there. Performance progress.
On my running order, it says forward programme, Mr. Hughes to update the note to the following items programme for forthcoming meetings. Well, I would assume that taxi fares and tariffs are the forward programme.
Well, the taxi fares obviously will go. We'll have the meeting, which is hopefully at the end of January with Guildford. Any changes, again, depending on what we may need or may not need to do. So I'm hopefully bring that back to you in the next meeting, next regulatory meeting, to give you a further update. The policy will go out to consultation, and there is a timetable, I believe, in the document to say when we'll be back. And the NAFAN, we're working on as a date for April. But apart from that, I've got nothing I'm aware of apart from drivers that are due to come to the subcommittee.
Yes, thank you very much. So the only item in the forward programme is the fares and tariffs, and then the consultation will come back to us, I assume. So the two same items will recur. Councillor Reid.
Thank you, Chairman. One of the things that we're waiting for is the government guidance on CCTV. Do we have any inkling of when that might be, and would we have to have a special meeting, or would you just deal with it?
Any changes to the policy will have to be passed through you and have a consultation. As regarding times, I expect probably after Brexit's dealt with at the moment. I think that's tying most of the government time up.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, because that's a longer meeting than we usually have, because there's some quite detailed things to look at. Thank you, officers, and that brings to an end our proceedings for today. Thank you.